Hello, and welcome to Book Explorers, where we share activities and discussions about terrific children's books. Today, we're talking about The New Kid, a thought-provoking, funny, and relatable graphic novel by Jerry Craft. My name is Liesl. I'm a children's librarian at the Central Library, and I'm here today with Alex, a reference librarian in the Western History and Genealogy Department. So, in The New Kid, the main character, Jordan, goes to a new school, a school he's never been to before. And at his new school, Jordan is one of the few Black students. Every day, he takes the bus from his neighborhood, where there are lots of Black people and people of color, to the wealthy, mostly white neighborhood where he goes to school. While he's on the bus, at the different stops, he changes his appearance along the way, and he acts differently to fit in with the different expectations. He's code switching. Once he gets to school, Jordan has interesting experiences. He meets some new friends. There's some funny stuff. There's some sad stuff. There's some frustrating stuff. And Jordan also faces racial bias. People treat him differently, and he faces different obstacles because he is Black. So this book made me think about the role that race plays in school. People who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or people who come from other backgrounds that are marginalized or underrepresented, often have to work harder to access education. So I got curious about what that looks like in Denver. I got curious about the different ways that people have worked to get equitable education, have worked to find access to education in Denver. And I wanted to learn more about the history here. So I asked Alex, who is in our Western History Department, who knows about Denver history and knows how to find information about Denver history. I asked him to help me research some stuff. So, Alex, after all that introduction, what came to mind when I asked you about the history of race and protest in Denver schools? Did you think of any specific events?
Yeah, so Denver's actually had a long history of racial strife, particularly centered around education, like a lot of cities in America. And one of the big events that kicked off a movement here was in March of 1969, and it was at West Side High School, the same West Side High School that's still there today. And Latino students staged a walkout, and a lot of that had to do with, for one, there was no teaching of Chicano history in the school, even though a lot of the students were Chicano. And there was also there was one teacher in particular who was accused of regularly making derogatory remarks about Mexican people, the kids' parents, Mexican food, all these other things. So they came up with a list of 9 demands and staged a walkout. And they were met with things like tear gas and abuse by authorities, which is something that you still see today.
Wow, that's fascinating. It really resonates with some of the protests for racial justice that were going on this summer. And I feel like those conversations haven't ended. They're still happening. And in The New Kid, Jordan works with one teacher in particular who he really struggles to get fair treatment from, and he really struggles to get her to see him the way that he sees himself. So it's really interesting and really relevant today. What else came up for you?
So there was also in 1970, and I don't know if anyone's heard of Rachel Knoll, but she was on the school board in Denver, and she was a big civil rights activist, and she was working to integrate schools through integrated busing, which is a lot like what Jordan's going through. And there was predictably a big backlash to that. And at one point, in the area where they park most of the Denver school buses, bombs were planted, and a third of the fleet of school buses was blown up, and they never caught the perpetrators.
The resistance, like the magnitude of the resistance to integrated schools is frustrating to hear about. It's hard to hear about.
Yeah, and this kind of thing went on all across the country too. So
Mhm. Yeah. How did you, when you were learning about these events, how did you start the research process? Where did you look first?
So, in the history department, one of the things we have to do is like find ways to time travel almost. Um, so we've got great resources, and these are available to all students if they ever want to do their own research. But one of my favorite things, I don't know how many kids remember when newspapers were all printed. That was the only way to read a newspaper. But for over 100 years, people have saved cut out articles from newspapers and put them into files that we can look at in the future based on different subjects. So I have one here that's all about school integration and busing in Denver. And the whole folder is just a gold mine of old newspaper clippings. And they've all got the date and the year and everything on them. So you can read through this just like people did on the day when they were published. And that's a good way to get an overview of what was happening at the time. And also, different from books written today, which have today's perspective, you can get more of the perspective of people living at that time and living through those events, which is really important. It kind of gives people who aren't around anymore a voice.
That's interesting.
Um,
You mentioned that they never found the perpetrators of the bus bombing in 1970, but at the time they didn't know that those people wouldn't be found. Like they're writing about it, the reporters were writing about it. It was still going on. It wasn't like the history wasn't finished yet. You didn't know the outcome of it. So that's really interesting to think about reading those different articles.
yeah, yeah. And a lot of times mysteries remain mysteries. Um, and another thing that we all often go to are archives. And these are just, we have a whole floor that's just filled with boxes of historical materials. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with Crusade for Justice or Corky Gonzalez. He was the leader of that. Um, but his entire collection was donated to the library. So we have boxes and boxes of material documenting Crusade for Justice, which includes events like the blowout, like the bus bombings, all kinds of things like that. And there might be newspaper clippings in there. There might be letters between individuals in the movement. There might be pamphlets recruiting people for the movement and explaining like what kind of problems they're trying to solve. Um, so that rounds out your perspective on history even more, looking at these primary source documents.
That's really interesting because when I think about like how change gets made and how we work towards a more just world, the thought of being able to like read the strategy of somebody who had that impact, who was really effective in that work, and to be able to see their actual thoughts on what was wrong and how to make it better. That's really a cool thing to be able to do.
Absolutely.
Did you learn when you were doing this research? Did you learn anything that surprised you?
Honestly, the magnitude, like I had heard about buses being bombed, but finding out that it was a third of the fleet, um, that was pretty impressive. And we also have some documents like from the FBI. A lot of them are heavily redacted, so you get see all those big black marks on there, so you don't get all the details. But at different times, a lot of the violence in the city they were trying to blame on the Chicano movement. They were trying to blame on the Black Panthers. So again, it's the marginalized people who become the focus, as opposed to their grievances and the things trying to get fixed. So that was kind of interesting because you see some of that happen today, although not as in your face, I guess, as it was in the 60s and 70s.
I'm really interested in how recent this history is. It doesn't, I know it's before I was alive, and it's before kids today were alive, but it's not that long ago. And to know that people are still working so hard in Denver to make sure that people have equitable access to school, and that when they're at school, they feel heard and seen and responded to. I think think it's fascinating, and I'm really interested to learn about the powerful people who have worked towards where we are now, and who are still working to make things better.
And one of the things that stands out today, I think, as opposed to the old news clippings and things, is at that time, you saw a lot of Chicanos marching here in Denver. You saw a lot of African Americans marching in the South, and there were always like some white allies. But what you see today, there's a lot more allies outside of just the specific group that is working towards their own civil rights.
Mm.
So that's kind of a big change, and seems to be a positive one.
That's really interesting too. It's interesting to think about what our role can be as individuals in joining a movement and joining with organizations that are doing this work. That's cool. I'm glad you brought that up. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Read the rest of this blog post to see all of the resources that Alex talked about and to get connected with the Western History and Genealogy Department. And check out all of our other New Kid resources with Book Explorers. Thanks, everyone. Bye.